Japan hasn't fought a war in 80 years, but a decision made thousands of miles away in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Washington can bring its economy to its knees without a single shot fired at Tokyo. This isn't a new vulnerability. It isn't a recent mistake. It is a permanent structural condition that has defined Japan's place in the global system for over half a century. And almost nobody talks about it until a crisis forces them to. Japan has almost zero oil. Not much, zero. The islands produce almost nothing. Every factory, every car, every light on in Tokyo tonight runs on imported energy. And 90% of that energy travels through one narrow corridor. A corridor that can close, a corridor that has come close to closing more than once, and a corridor that will be threatened again. That corridor is the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That's it, 21 miles between the Persian Gulf and the rest of the world. Every single day, roughly 20% of all global oil passes through that gap. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, all of it funnels through one choke point, one that Iran sits directly on top of. This has been true for decades. It will be true for decades more. And Japan sits at the end of that pipeline with almost nothing in reserve. Not because Japan's leaders are incompetent, but because the geography leaves almost no other option. Japan imports over 90% of its energy, and the bulk of that comes from the Persian Gulf. The question that never gets a clean answer: how long could Japan actually last? Officially, Japan holds about 254 days of strategic reserves. Sounds like a cushion, and it's not 254 days of normal life. That's 254 days of rationing, of shutting down industries, of making impossible choices about who gets fuel and who doesn't. Manufacturers would be the first to feel it. Japan's entire export economy, Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, the supply chains feeding half of Asia, runs on uninterrupted energy. Interrupt the energy and you don't just hurt Japan. You send shockwaves through every country that depends on Japanese parts. South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, the whole regional supply chain starts to wobble from a disruption Japan had no hand in creating and no power to stop. Here is where it gets interesting, and this is what analysis never slows down to explain properly. Japan can't fix this alone. It has no military option but self-defense. Its constitution limits offensive military capacity. It can't escort tankers through the Gulf. It can't threaten Iran. It can't negotiate directly with the parties that control the choke point. So Japan is completely dependent on the US to keep the strait open, which means every time Washington and Tehran move toward confrontation, every cycle, every escalation, every crisis, Japan holds its breath. Japan isn't a player in these conflicts, it's a hostage. And the ransom is paid in oil prices, trade deficits, and geopolitical loyalty every single time pressure builds in the Gulf. This is not a 2025 problem. It is not a 2026 problem. It is a permanent feature of Japan's position in the global order. One that has repeated in 1973, in 1979, in 1990, in 2019, and will repeat again. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a Middle East story. It's a story about how geography becomes power and how a country thousands of miles from the conflict can be the one that suffers most. Japan learned this in 1973. The lesson didn't expire. It never does. Every country that depends on the Gulf oil faces a version of this problem, but not equally, not with the same options, not with the same constraints. China imports even more Gulf oil than Japan, but unlike Japan, it has leverage over the countries that control the choke point, whether it uses that leverage and what it costs to use it. Now that's a completely different calculation.